Welcome to That They May All Be One, the podcast of the Center for Catholic and Evangelical Theology. The CCET is a theological enterprise of Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox Christians whose goal is to promote faithfulness throughout the Church to the Word of God in Jesus Christ. It seeks to advance the knowledge of God's revelation as authoritatively mediated by Holy Scripture and normatively interpreted by the Church's creedal and dogmatic tradition. Without avoiding the difficult issues that divide us, it seeks ways in which our traditions, East and West, Reformation and Catholic, North and South, might enrich one another in pursuit of Christian unity. We are glad that you have joined us. Welcome to the podcast of the Center for Catholic and Evangelical Theology, That They May All Be One. I'm your host, Doug Sweeney, Executive Director of the CCET, and I'm glad that you've joined us. Our topic today is the work of the founders of our center, Braaten and Robert Jenson, both of whom have died, I'm sad to say, in the last several years. The legacy of their ecumenical work in particular lives on in all we do, and we have a couple of guests on the show with us today who know a great deal about that work. Dr. Bruce D. Marshall is the layman professor of Christian theology at Southern Methodist University. He's a past president of the Academy of Catholic Theology and now serves on the editorial board of Pro Ecclesia, the scholarly journal of our center. He's the author of a great deal of theological scholarship that bears quite directly on our thinking at the CCET, including Trinity and Truth, and Christology and Conflict, the Identity of a Savior in Ronner and Bart. Dr. Adam Eitel, our second guest, is an associate professor of theology at Dallas University. He's previously served as lecturer of theology and ethics at both Yale Divinity School and Princeton University. His interests include medieval scholastic theology, the history of Christian moral thought, and contemporary social ethics and criticism. He's the author of numerous articles, the transcriber and editor of one of Robert Jenson's books, A Theology in Outline, Can These Bones Live?, and has a couple of books forthcoming, including Thomas Aquinas and the Invention of the Preacher. So we're excited to have both Dr. Marshall and Dr. Eitel on the program with us today. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us.
Thanks so much for having us, Doug.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's start by asking you a more personal question. You have written about Braaten and Jenson, taught a little bit about their theology, but you also have known them personally a bit. When did you first get to know either Karl Braaten or Robert Jenson or both of them? What's a little bit of the history of your engagement with them? Bruce, maybe since you're the elder of the two and maybe have the longest history, we can start with you.
Yeah, elder definitely. Yes, I first met Jens, as everyone who knew him called him. I think Blanche gave him that name. When I was a doctoral student at Yale, so close to 45 years ago, and he came to visit. I'd read some of his work. Sometimes I disagreed with him, but I had lunch with him. I don't remember exactly how that happened, but I was so impressed with him. He was just so smart, I mean, that was the first thing that kind of struck me about him, was that he was so quick and completely engaged with what we were talking about. It wasn't, he was showing me how quick he was. It was that, well, you said this about God, but what about this? I mean, and that was always the way he was. He was always wanting to talk about God. And that just made a strong impression on me. And my subsequent years as a colleague of his at St. Olaf, I was fortunate to work with him as a colleague for 10 years at St. Olaf before he retired. And then, to everyone's happiness, went to the center in Princeton, the CTI, and became the director of studies there. But all that grew greatly as he and his wife and my wife Sandy and I got to know the Jensons quite well. And then Karl Braaten moved to Northfield during that time and founded the center. So I was there when the center was founded and was part of the ongoing enterprise as a very junior member early in my career at St. Olaf.
Adam, you're too young to have that much history with Jens and Karl Braaten, but what is your history with the two of them, just personally speaking?
Okay, well, I only met Braaten through Jensen, and there were a couple of times that we had an afternoon to chat, but I spent a lot of time with Jens, and I mean, I'm very fortunate, things like this happen to me. I've lived a kind of strange, charmed life, I guess, but I remember, I mean, this is exactly what happened. I was a student at Princeton Seminary. I was in my second year there. I had discovered for myself the work of Robert Jenson, and I I was moving quick through things, too quick. You look back and you realize how little you understood. But I I began to read his systematic theology, and I was so captivated by its breadth, and on the one hand, and its brevity on the other. I couldn't believe that someone could say so much by saying so little, and there was a kind of wit and a kind of lightness in it. There was something attractive, and I remember I was sitting where the journals are one day, and Bruce McCormick, who's a professor of mine at that point, walked over to look at a journal and saw me reading the first volume of Jens's Systematic. And he said, well, Jens lives right down the corner, right down the street here. And I said, what do you mean he lives right down the street? He just lives right there. You could walk there in 2 minutes. And I started packing up my books. And I said, you got to be kidding me. He said, Adam, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to go meet Robert Jenson. And he said, Bruce, let us be ourselves. And he said, okay, good luck. And so but on the way there, I actually happened to run into Blanche, and who I had seen with Jens once at a conference. And so I said, are you Blanche? She said, yes. And I said, well, I'm Adam Eitel, and I hear I've been reading your husband's work, and I would like to talk to him. Do you think he's available? And she kind of had this, glimmer in her eye. That was actually the day they were moving him out of the CTI. He had just finished. He was retiring. And so I didn't realize at the time, there was actually this big gap, void in this man's life. It's the first time that he didn't have students actively to teach or seminars actively to run. And there I was in his living room. I just kind of forced myself in. And then what followed there, we met at 2:00 on Friday for 10 years, I think. And yeah, he taught me more than anyone's ever taught me.
Wow. And so when, Adam, was it decided that you would edit his theology and outline? How did that happen?
Oh, it was the kind of one of the same deals. I said, hey, gents, let's do this. And he said, okay, yeah, okay. He had a way about it. But I had kind of elbowed my way into being his teaching fellow at the university, in a course that ended up being the last course he taught there, and I think the last course he taught, and it was a real event. And I had it the forethought to record the lectures, and over the course of a couple years, without telling Jens, I transcribed them, and so I brought them to him one day and said, "What do you think of this?" And he just kind of said, "All right, let's go," and we got to work on turning the transcriptions of the lectures into little chapters.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, it occurs to me we should not assume that everybody listening to this conversation already knows a lot about the theology of either Jens or Karl Braaten. So can I pose just a kind of a big question to the two of you, and I'll let each of you kind of take it in whatever direction you wish. What do listeners need to know about the theology of these men? What difference has it made in the theological world? What would be a good way to introduce oneself, if you've not already done so, to the theology of maybe Robert Jenson especially, but also Karl Braaten? And maybe Adam, since we're just finishing up with you, we can start with you this time.
Okay, I think what I have to say this time can be brief, and it really echoes something that that Bruce already said. Jens was always talking about God. He was intoxicated with not just the idea of God, but with God. And for him, theology was from beginning to end just all about God. He wrote, I mentioned his systematic theology, and the second part isn't an afterthought, but you do get the impression that if he could have just written a systematic theology where the only topic is God, he would have done it. In some ways, the very who God is, the nature of God, and our misconceptions, as Jens understood them, the various kinds of metaphysical hangovers that have kind of accrued in the tradition, that get in the way of our thinking about and speaking of God as in himself, and as he is for us, as Jens would say. This was the sum and substance of theology to Jens, and I think I don't know if Bruce would agree with that or not, but that's what I would
Yeah,
say.
I completely agree with that. And the same was true of Carl. I mean, they were different personalities, different kinds of intellectuals. But they both wrote a lot. They both wrote coming out of a Midwestern Lutheran background. This is not sort of completely trivial. They were both somewhat rebels against the Lutheranism of their school days at Luther Seminary in the early 50s. Jens went off to Germany, which was very formative for him, to study with Peter Brunner, one of the great Lutheran theologians, not well known in the English-speaking world, but one of the great Lutheran theologians of the 20th century. And Carl went to Harvard and worked with Paul Tillich, among others. So they were both wanted to get out of the orbit that they had grown up in, but not to leave it behind. And I think this comes through in the way that both of them, and this is just following up on what Adam just said, both of them believed in God at a deep level, and that had believed that God had a claim on their lives. I remember talking to Carl once at a dinner at the Jensons' house. It was from one of the center events back maybe in the early 90s. And he was talking about how terrifying it is to get up and preach because he's speaking for God. And it was very emotional when he was talking about it. It was like, who am I, to speak for God? I mean, and to me, that was certainly completely true of Jens, as Adam has beautifully said, and a sense that, we seek to understand what God wants to teach us and what God wants to reveal to us, but we don't get to tell God what to do and how to talk about God. I mean, that went really deep with them, and I think that's a huge contribution, particularly in the contemporary theological arena, and maybe in the theological arena of my adulthood as a whole, where there's so much theology that's more about me making my proposal or whatever the case may be, rather than who am I to speak of God, and if I do, what am I going to say that's really something I have any standing to say. I think both of them really were motivated by that question.
That's wonderful. So I want to ask a follow-up. I'm about to ask in a few minutes what difference Jenson and Braaten and their work has made in the churches. But before we get to the ecclesial dimension of the conversation, can we ask the question and just be utterly honest about it? To what extent did these two guys make a difference in the world of theological studies? Would you say they're people that the students are still reading today? How would you characterize their scholarly theological legacy? Bruce, you want to take a stab at that one first?
Sure, and I'll be brief on this point. I think Carl made more of an impact in the Lutheran world. Jens's impact extends farther beyond the Lutheran world than Carl's. Carl, particularly later in his life, was unhappy with the way things were going in the Lutheran world that he had been in his whole life, in what became the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and at the same time was committed to remaining a part of that community and to being a voice for what he thought of as responsible discourse in that world. And Jens did too. I think Jens's impact is greater in the theological world as a whole. He once said to me, I'd forgotten about this since I was thinking about this conversation we were going to have, that a critic of his, I think this was early in my acquaintance with him, so 40 years ago, a critic of his had said, well, Jenson has a lot of good ideas. It's too bad that he always expresses them in a denominational idiolect. That of specifically kind of continental Lutheranism. And Jens laughed about this and said, well, yeah, I mean, that's sort of true. But I think that he moved beyond that idiolect more and more. Never left it in the sense of thinking it was wrong or abandoning it, but developed and enriched it, and more than Carl did. And I think that has something to do with why his theology has had a broader impact. And then just to repeat something that to me is always fundamental when talking about Jens, is just the brilliance of it. I mean, I often disagree with him when I'm reading his systematic theology or whatever, but no one has provoked me to think about what I ought to say if I'm going to say anything about God more than he had. And sometimes precisely because he says things I think have to be wrong, but he says them with such force and clarity and insight, thoughts you would not have had in your head if he hadn't put them there. That I think that has a lot to do with the broader impact he's had.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Adam? You're obviously a great example of a younger, up-and-coming theologian who's still working hard, at least on Jenson's theology. What would you say about Braaten's scholarly theological legacy more generally?
I want to preface my answer by saying that it really is reflective of my own experience, and not a survey of everything that's going on in the field right now. I taught for 8 years at Yale, and prior to that, I was a student. We lived in Princeton, except for a stint. We had a year or more over abroad in Fribourg in Switzerland. So my impression of what's going on in a lot of academic theology in the Protestant world is going to be shaped by my experience there. And so I have to say, I mean, Jenson isn't read much, but I think I would then have to say there isn't a lot of theology that's being read, and I don't mean that pejoratively. Okay, I really don't. So let me make a distinction though. At Yale, it was it was an interesting thing because there were a lot of graduate students there who were the same age or older than me when I first started teaching there myself right out of grad school, and so I had a number of friends who were actually finishing their PhDs there, and so I got to know a lot of these folks pretty well. But they themselves, they used to have a distinction. It was kind of a joke, but not a joke. They used to say, "Yeah, Jens, he's a theological theologian." And what they meant by that was a theologian who wrote about theology as it would have been understood by virtually anyone who does theology until very recently. And so, no, right at the moment, I wouldn't say that there's a lot of doctrinal theology being written, being argued about. There are, of course, exceptions, but even kind of the high octane systematic theology that I'm familiar with, a lot of it is about something very different than ever would have captivated a Jens or a Braaten.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Can I add a comment on that, Doug?
Oh, yeah.
So I'm teaching a seminar, I just got out of it, on the Christian doctrine of God, and we're reading mostly the Prima Pars of Aquinas and the first volume of Genesis Systematics.
Hmm.
And it really does seem right to me, as Adam said, that if you want to do theological theology, that's John Webster's phrase, a famous
Okay, I didn't
article
know
of
that.
his
Yeah.
20 years ago on theological theology. That's a theology that doesn't have some adjectival modifier that makes it worthwhile. And we don't need to go through what all the many modifiers are that are in circulation. Um, and if you want to do that, then you're going to read someone like Jenson. Among recent writers, you're going to go right to him. Um, he has a bit of a drawback, which is, particularly as a Catholic and a convert now of many years to Catholicism, he's not as well known in the Catholic world. That's a failing of the Catholic world, which tends to have its own sort of school traditions as to what should and shouldn't be read. And so it's only more adventuresome Catholic theologians who read Jens. But I think that's where his future maybe lies more, is in sort of Catholic theologians who really care about doing theological theology. And not all Catholic theologians care about that either, but the ones who do, I think, are going to turn to Jens.
Would you guys describe the ecclesial legacies of Jenson and Braaten in ways that are analogous to the ways you just described their more scholarly theological legacies? I mean, on the one hand, they're both active Lutheran churchmen.
Mm-hmm.
They're very much invested in a brighter future for Lutheran church life, ecumenical theological life.
Mm-hmm.
So one might think that their influence on church life is really denominationally specific. But we have two Catholics on the program today talking about their theological legacy. And Bruce has just talked about how adventuresome Catholic theologians might well dive into Jenson's theology. So how should we talk about the ecclesial legacies of these two men and their theological work? What do you think about that, Adam?
Well, I don't know if this is the right point in the program to share what I think I can say, but so maybe I'll just say Jenson Braaten believed that there were, in fact, churches. And they also believed that there is a one church. And I think you'd find, so there's so much good work being done, and it's impossible for any of us to keep up with any of it. My head, I'm just finishing the translation of this work from the 13th century, so it's like I know more about that right now than I know about what's going on in ecumenism today. But I think you'd have to cast about to find people who thought, as Jens certainly and Braaten as well thought, that there really is a church, and that there are also churches, and that this is a theological problem and also a problem for the church. It's really something that has to be there's something that has to be done, something incumbent upon us, a burden we all carry because of the fracture within the church. And so when and how people will wake up to that again, I don't know, but it's hard to know. Academia is a dishonest hemisphere. If you talk about what's going on in academic theology, you very well may not have any idea what's really going on in the theology of the church. I think I know, but you might, yeah.
All right, so Bruce, I want to hear what you think about this. I mean, we'll get in just a minute. We'll talk about their ecumenical legacies. We'll talk about their legacies through our center, some of their ecumenical theological work. Is that what should be said, Bruce? about their ecclesial legacy, or is there something else besides their ecumenical legacy that we should note?
Yeah, I agree with what Adam said. I would add one further point, which is might sound negative, but I don't think it is. It's not negative about them. They devoted a lot of time and energy to the Lutheran Church, and to the Lutheran Church to which they belonged, which had been the ALC, and then American Lutheran Church, which was closely related to the Lutheran Church in America, which I had belonged to, then became the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in the early 80s, mid 80s. They were devoted to fostering an ecumenical Lutheran theological culture within the ELCA. And that didn't work. It didn't happen. And so in that sense, they failed. I don't think they failed in that they didn't do what needed to be done for this to happen, but it says something about where the Protestant churches are, the mainline Protestant churches are now. Now that, could raise all sorts of questions that we might want to talk about, but I mean, the mainline churches especially are precisely, were once deeply interested in the question that Adam rightly identified as central to them. There is a church of Jesus Christ, and there are churches, and there's something out of kilter about that situation, that there are churches and a church which is not simply the sum of those churches. And they cared about that, and the Lutheran churches of their and my younger years cared about that. And that's what I think has largely gone away. So the ecumenical questions don't matter to the mainline Protestant churches of today in the way that they mattered to Jenson Braaten and that they mattered to me, in my own growing up as a theologian. And I was also, I should mention, a student of George Lindbeck, to whom they also mattered very greatly. He and Jensen Carl were in that respect all engaged in a project within Lutheranism to try and establish a kind of theological culture which didn't come about. So yes, I agree with what Adam said, and I think that a really significant question for us now is how does that conversation move forward when some of the important parties to it ecclesially are no longer interested in it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Can we spend just a few minutes sort of addressing it pretty directly?
Yeah.
It's the ecumenical theological work of Braaten and Jenson that gave birth to the Center for Catholic and Evangelical Theology. There's one book in particular that was especially important to our founding, In One Body Through the Cross, the Princeton Proposal for Christian Unity, which got published in 2003 and shaped the work of the center for a fair bit of time. Braaten and Jenson were well-known ecumenists, but they were well-known ecumenists who were unhappy with other kinds of ecumenism and wanted to be known for championing a special kind of ecumenism as a way forward into the 21st century for our churches. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What was their ecumenical theology like? What was their ecumenical program like? And then we'll talk in a minute about the legacies of that kind of interest on their part. Bruce, do you want to start by just telling us what their ecumenical theology was, what their approach to ecumenism was?
Sure. So it seems to me a couple of points are really important. First of all, and the Princeton proposal very much embodies this, and it may be the last great example of this, actually, in the post-Vatican II ecumenical ferment. The Princeton proposal centered on the question of doctrinal unity, that if there's going to be ecumenism that's worth doing, that's worth bothering with, if there's going to be an effort for the reunion of divided Christians that's going to be worth bothering with, it has to be doctrinal. It has to address the fundamental doctrinal questions that have divided the churches over time. So that was not new with them. That was not anything that they thought up, but they embraced it and pushed it in a very important way, and the Princeton proposal is the fruit of that. And they also pressed for something that was preceded them, that was part of the post-Vatican II ecumenical enterprise, but again is largely now left behind, namely that the unity we seek, to use a standard ecumenical phrase, the unity that we seek has to be visible. It has to involve a genuine, to use an old Lutheran locution, a genuine communio in sacris, a sharing of sacred things, and a sharing specifically around the table of the Lord. And that requires doctrinal agreement. So they were deeply committed to that. Again, it wasn't original with them, but they carried it forward in a striking way. They were doing the Princeton proposal at a time when the future of ecumenism was less clear than it maybe had been a generation or two before. And so they were also kind of rallying to the traditional concern that division among Christians is still an issue. It's, Adam already touched on this very helpfully. It's still something we have to care about. We can't just say, oh, well, that's the way it is. We can just worry about other things. So those are all really important elements, none of them entirely original with the Jenson Braaten, but I think quite important to them. I think maybe an aspect of the Princeton proposal that incorporates all that stuff, but that's maybe more distinctive, is a kind of, I'll put this in a maybe overly direct, not overly direct, but overly schematic way. There's an influence of Ephraim Radner's way of thinking about Christian disunity in the Princeton proposal, which I'm not against, but I mean, it's rather striking, namely that the disunity of the church is doctrinal, but it's deeper than that. And it involves some kind of willful disregard that sunders the body of Christ, that the body of Christ in the present world is the crucified body. It's not the risen body. Now, that's not programmatic in the Princeton proposal, but I think it's important to the outlook. And I remember having some rather vehement discussions with Jens about this, where he was pretty emphatic that we have to be very realistic about the reality of our disunity. And again, I think that's something that the churches have largely lost interest in.
Do you agree, Adam? Is that the way you'd put it? Is that something that's captivated you in your relationship with Jens as well?
Well, so when I came to know Jens, there were a couple of years during the early years when we were getting to know each other that he had me reading some of the Finnish Lutheran interpretations of Luther and his work, particularly focused around the Galatians commentary, which was seen as a kind of, as a loophole, if I could put it that way. I mean, I don't mean to put it pejoratively, because I think it's a beautiful interpretation, but by privileging certain of Luther's works that are argued in more exegetical and a mythopoetic style at times, that kind of has the flavor of this won't be right, but that kind of Rhineland mysticism lurking deep in the background, that there you can find something that can play nicely with a Catholic account of justification. And that was really important to Jenson.
Mm-hmm.
I think he thought probably that the Finns were right about the text they interpreted, but probably in the end wrong, that it was Luther's view. But also it was important to Jenson, he was happy to say, it didn't really matter. What mattered was which of them was which of them was more true.
Was more
And
true.
for Jens, it was the one that better accorded with the Catholic teaching. And but I as regards ecumenism today, I mean, I'm not, part of the explanation for just the state of things, I think is, could be cashed out sociologically. My impression is that ecumenism, as it was flowering in the days of Jens and Braaten, it was also a highly clerical conversation. But look who you're talking to now. I'm not a priest. I'm not a deacon, and
Nor am I.
I do hope to be a deacon one day. I would love. It would be a dream come true. But but that's beside the point. The point is that there's the actual work of church unity that in an Episcopal communion, where like the Lutheran Church or like the Catholic Church, can only be really carried out by clerics, or has to be led by them. And theology is increasingly a lay pursuit, and that's even true. That's true even in Catholic theology, I think.
So what does all this mean for the future of ecumenism? We at the Center for Catholic and Evangelical Theology are confronted all the time with the notion that especially into the 21st century, we've entered into a season of what everybody calls an ecumenical winter. They compare the post-Vatican II years and the electricity in the air, at meetings that were ecumenical, and the energy that was associated with some of the key ecumenical dialogues that culminated in the late 20th century on the one hand, with just a dearth of that kind of activity in the 21st century. And of course, at the center, we care deeply about this. We're working hard right now to attract a new generation of church people and theologians into the work of the center in promotion of the visible unity of God's people. Mm-hmm. Is this a naive errand? I mean, what do you guys think about this? Where are we with respect to ecumenical theology and its potential moving forward? What do you think, Bruce?
No, I don't think it's a naive errand, and your question is very lucidly put. So I do think there's a way forward, and I'll say what it is, but against the background of the point about the importance of doctrinal ecumenism that the generations after Vatican II were so committed to on the Protestant and Catholic side, and that Jens and Karl were deeply committed to. So I think two things happened there that sort of jointly are involved in this ecumenical winter, or maybe constitute this ecumenical winter. On the one hand, you have what the Princeton proposal was engaged with and concerned about is there's something deeper going on, particularly after the Lutheran Roman Catholic joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, which, Luther famously said if the Pope would agree to the right teaching on justification, he would kiss his feet and hold him aloft in the streets. Well, all right, now we have an agreement, and yet it doesn't seem to have made any difference. I mean, on either the Lutheran or the Catholic side. So there's something deeper going on. And that's the crucified body issue and so forth, and the sort of willful separation issue, and what's going on here. But that's one side. So the doctrinal aspect seems like it isn't enough. And Cardinal Ratzinger, as he then was before he became Pope, he also talked about this, that the agreements on doctrine are important, but there's clearly a spiritual component to ecumenism that needs to be much more profoundly realized. But then on the other side, I think on the mainline Protestant churches, not the evangelical churches, but the mainline Protestant churches just lost interest in the doctrinal issues as a whole. And so you had these kind of conversations, which were rather painful. I wasn't part of these dialogues, but Mike Root, for example, was, after the joint declaration. What remains to be worked out? The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America really doesn't encourage abortion, but certainly has no problem with it, okay? the Catholic Church does have a problem with it. What are we going to do about that? I mean, and the answer was, we don't really know what we're going to do about it. So those kinds of issues became, the really divisive issues, not the traditional doctrinal issues. So, and this is my takeaway, okay? The place where I think a fruitful doctrinal discussion can take place and needs to take place is between, especially in America, is between Catholics and evangelicals. In the traditional sense of evangelical, not in the lowercase e sense of evangelical. Because I don't think the mainline Protestant churches any longer, and I don't, I was once part of that community, one of those communities. That's a long time ago. I'm not meaning this as a derisive comment, but I just don't think they're that interested in these questions anymore. In my experience, at any rate, evangelicals are. So I think that's where the conversation needs to go.
Yeah, I think you're right. Speaking as an evangelical, I think you're right about the evangelicals.
Right.
Adam, what do you think? What's your experience here, and what do you think the prospects are moving forward for those of us interested in working together on visible unity?
Well, I agree. I agree with Bruce. I think that I think I am an evangelical, and I'm certain of it. I'm as evangelical as anyone who has a claim to that name, and I'm Catholic. And for me, becoming Catholic wasn't about leaving that behind. I I agree with Bruce that the mainline Protestant churches are not interested. Okay, there might be, of course, there must be some young pastors, elders, and others who would love to push the churches back toward this conversation, but I think they've just don't have a grip on the helm, and for now I think the die is cast. And on the other hand, these churches are, and they know it. I don't know how exactly the extent, but they're not. A lot of them don't give much evidence of that they'll be around for much longer. And on what's happening is that, on the other hand, there's this amorphous, hard to define group that we're calling now evangelicals that are just carrying on with a kind of mere Christianity, and they're doing okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they're doing okay. But I guess I would add to the point about evangelicalism, and something that this may just be entirely biographical, and again limited to my own experience, but my impression is that where the conversation will land within evangelicalism is specifically as a conversation between Catholicism and the more charismatic varieties of evangelicals. And the reason why is, if you think, for instance, okay, if you go down the street to the Vineyard Fellowship where we would worship on Sunday evenings as Catholics. We wouldn't take it wasn't sacramental worship, but this was praise and worship. We'd go, our kids would have a youth group, and the people would come in New Haven from here's the Orthodox priest, and here's the Episcopalian priest, and that's the most ecumenical thing I've ever seen, is there are just people there worshiping the Lord together. But there's something that actually brings them all together that is specifically but not exclusively charismatic. And that's this. If you're a man like John Wimber, well, then you believe in the presence of God, and that in worship, in prayer, in life, God can be in a place in a special way. He's everywhere, but then he's here, and they'll say, and I'll say, I feel the presence of God. God is with us, and that's something that seminaries today will try to beat out of seminarians, but they ought not forget that. But if you think that, you believe that God can be in a place present, well, then, you're just one step away from saying, as the Catholic Church says, well, you bet he's right here in the bread,
Hmm.
in the wine. That
Hmm.
here he is. You can eat and drink him. And as Augustine says, you will not convert me into you. I will convert you into me. And there's already something, there's already now this is going to sound like ecumenism for me just means an on-ramp for charismatics into the Catholic Church. And I guess and I guess I do think that, but but I also am recognizing that that would be precisely the conversion of people who are in fact Christians to Catholicism. So I've said a lot, but I do think there is a there is a big conversation to be had between Catholics and charismatic evangelicals. John Wimber, who's kind of a hero of mine. So, I mean, it kind of surprises me I'm even talking about him uh, because I never do talk about him. But he described the vineyard as what did he say? Like a third way or a middle way. It wasn't Pentecostalism. Okay, it's something. It's evangelicalism, but it has a kind of, but they believe in the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the presence of God, and so on. Yeah.
That's a good word. I can testify personally. I did a podcast a few months ago with Caleb Maskell, who does a theological
Oh yeah,
podcast
Caleb.
for the Vineyard, and he
Yeah,
wanted to talk about my interest in evangelical Catholicism and its potential, in the Vineyard. So I agree. There's a lot of interest there.
Caleb's a good friend of mine.
Yeah.
Adam, I really appreciate the point you made. I think it's profoundly right that um, doctrinal issues between evangelicals and Catholics can be discussed, and we'll be interested in discussing them. But it's possible to discuss them because we believe God is real and that God makes himself present to us. Um, and I'll tell a little story. So 35 years ago, this month, okay, in January of 1990, I was with a colleague from St. Olaf and a group of 31 students in the Soviet Union,
Mm.
as it then was. And we were doing a month-long study trip on the Orthodox Church in Russia and other parts of the world close to it. And we went into an old believer church in Moscow, an Orthodox church, which was about as foreign to this group of Minnesota Lutherans as you could possibly imagine. Okay, chanting and incense, and most of it was behind a wall that you couldn't see. And I was talking with two young women about it. These young women are now in their 50s. I was talking, to them about it over dinner that evening in the hotel. How did you like that? One of them said, well, they don't ever say anything in their own natural human voice. They're always chanting and whatnot. The other one said, yeah, I get what you mean. But I realized that I didn't believe God was real until I went into that church.
Mm.
And now I know God is real. If
Yeah.
you think God is real, then you're going to have certain agenda, and again, your point about God makes himself present to us. We can argue about that. We can disagree about that and talk about it. But if that's a good starting point to have for a very fruitful conversation between evangelicals and Catholics.
What a great way to end our conversation for today. We too believe that God is real at the Center for Catholic and Evangelical Theology. We invite you to join us as we work together as Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant Christians on the unity of the Church and on ecumenical theology. Thank you for tuning in to That They May All Be One, the new podcast of the CCET. Thank you, Dr. Marshall, Dr. Eitel, for being with us today. Please join us, listeners, as we work with Jesus on the unity of his church. You've been listening to the podcast of the Center for Catholic and Evangelical Theology, That They May All Be One. Thanks for tuning in. Please join us again next time as we continue to seek ways in which God's people, past and present, near and far, might enrich one another in pursuit of Christian unity.